And there was a lot of crossfades and stuff between all the tracks. They had all to be done separately, and then they all have to be edited in the old days before Pro Tools. When it was finally finished, we sat down in the control room at Abbey Road, listened to it all the way through.
Picture this. David Gilmour alone, long after the lights have died and the crowds have gone home. Not calm silence, hostile silence. The kind that grinds on your nerves. Guitars line the walls like evidence at a trial. This isn't reflection, this is accusation. For a brief second, it feels like he's about to name just one band, one crime rock history committed and never paid for. But that thought doesn't survive. It wasn't one, it was four. Four bands chewed up, sidelined, or quietly erased. Not because they lacked brilliance, but because they refused to kneel. Because they didn't play the industry's game. Because subtlety is useless in a culture addicted to noise, speed, and obedience. And the first name lands like a clenched fist. Camel. Camel weren't weak. They were a problem, and the industry knew it immediately. Long songs that refused to hurry, slow burns that denied instant gratification, no shortcuts, no hooks designed to please radio programmers or algorithms. Camel demanded patience at the exact moment patience was being strangled out of music. While others simplified, trimmed, and smiled for the cameras, Camel stretched time and tension like a weapon. They trusted listeners to think, to feel gradually, to sit inside discomfort instead of skipping past it. And for that crime, they were punished relentlessly, labeled boring, labeled indulgent, quietly shelved while louder, emptier bands were handed crowns and called revolutionary. What makes it unforgivable is how deliberate it was. Camel weren't ignored, they were sidelined. Their ambition made executives nervous. Their refusal to explain themselves made critics hostile. Music that didn't bend was treated as a threat that needed to be neutralized. They weren't lacking power, they refused to dilute it. And that refusal didn't just cost them success, it cost them history. Their influence was stolen, their patience mocked. Their legacy buried under bands that learned how to make themselves smaller and easier to consume. That bitterness doesn't fade, it hardens. And it drags Gilmour's thoughts forward, angrier now, sharper, unwilling to let the pattern slide.
On this occasion, I was sitting there, and on a piece of paper next to me was this poem that she had written to me, and I was sort of picking up the paper, looking at that scansion. Sounds like it might be about right. So
Procol Harum. Procol Harum carried weight most bands were afraid of. Classical gravity, lyrical ambition, emotional seriousness, music that didn't beg for approval or chase validation. They sounded like a band that assumed the listener was capable of thought, and that assumption alone made them dangerous. But seriousness doesn't sell fast. It doesn't trend. It doesn't scream for attention. So history did what it always does when confronted with depth. It simplified them into a single song and threw the rest away. Everything they built after was ignored, flattened, stripped of context. Years of ambition reduced to a convenient reference point, instead of acknowledged as architects of something heavier, richer, more demanding. What infuriates Gilmour is how intentional it all feels. This wasn't neglect, it was design, a system choosing comfort over challenge, familiarity over risk. Procol Harum were too slow, too thoughtful, too unwilling to play dumb for mass approval. They weren't forgotten by accident, they were reduced on purpose. And that reduction is violent in its own quiet way, because it teaches artists exactly what happens when they refuse to make themselves smaller. The anger sharpens. Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant didn't challenge listeners, they exposed them. They ripped the comfort away and dared people to keep listening. Abrupt shifts, complex structures, sudden turns that refused to hold your hand. This wasn't music for consumption. This was music that demanded effort, intelligence, and attention, and punished anyone who showed up half awake. And the response was cowardly. Radio didn't even try. Critics panicked, unable to package what they couldn't simplify. Audiences, trained to expect repetition and reassurance, labeled them difficult instead of intelligent. In a culture terrified of effort, Gentle Giant chose evolution and were punished brutally for it. What enrages Gilmour is how predictable it all was. The moment a band refuses to repeat itself, the knives come out. Complexity becomes arrogance. Ambition becomes indulgence. Anything that doesn't fit the format gets shoved aside and quietly buried. They weren't obscure. They were uncompromising. And uncompromising artists scare systems built on control. Gentle Giant refused to slow down for the audience, refused to soften the edges, refused to pretend depth was optional. They played as if intelligence still mattered, and that alone made them dangerous. And compromise, Gilmour knows, is the entrance fee to survival. Gentle Giant refused to pay it. Then comes the band history still deliberately misunderstands. The Moody Blues. They dared to be emotional when irony became fashionable. They chose sincerity when cynicism sold better. They built music around feeling instead of aggression, around reflection instead of rebellion. While others sharpened their edges, the Moody Blues opened their chests. And for that, they were mocked relentlessly. Soft, excessive, outdated. Critics treated vulnerability like weakness, depth like embarrassment, as if caring too much were a flaw that needed correcting. In an era racing toward cool detachment, they refused to hide behind irony. What infuriates Gilmour is how calculated that dismissal was. The Moody Blues weren't naive. They were intentional. They understood exactly what they were risking by choosing emotion, and they chose it anyway. They wrote about time, loss, inner space, the slow ache of being human, while the world demanded volume and attitude. But Gilmour knows the truth most refuse to admit. It takes more courage to be open than to be loud, more strength to reveal than to dominate. Anyone can shout. Not everyone can stand still and mean something. When the names finally stop, there's no relief, only pressure. The weight of realizing how often sincerity is punished and how quickly honesty is rewritten as weakness. These bands weren't missing talent. They were missing permission. And that leaves a question hanging in the air, sharp, ugly, and unavoidable. How many great bands were buried, not because they failed, but because they refused to harden themselves into something easier to sell? Some bands dominate by force, others vanish by principle. And sometimes the most underrated music is the kind the system fears most, because it exposes too much, feels too deeply, and refuses to obey. Gilmour doesn't soften the conclusion. He lets it burn. He doesn't look for comfort in legacy or numbers or applause. He looks straight at the damage, at the patterns, at the quiet wreckage left behind by a system that pretends it rewards talent. History, he knows, doesn't reward depth. It rewards compliance, speed, and spectacle. It rewards artists who learn when to bend, when to simplify, when to make themselves smaller so the machine can move faster. Anything that slows it down gets crushed without apology, and then rewritten as if it never mattered. That realization carries anger, but also clarity. Because real music has never belonged to history. History edits, history sanitizes, history turns danger into decoration. Real music lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in risk, in friction, in discomfort, in artists who refuse permission, who accept isolation instead of surrender, who understand that honesty has a cost and decide to pay it anyway. Bands like these didn't lose. They chose. And maybe being underrated was never a failure at all. Maybe it was the unavoidable consequence of refusing to shrink, refusing to obey, refusing to turn depth into background noise. So the final question doesn't feel rhetorical, it feels accusatory. How many great bands were erased not because they weren't good enough, but because they were too difficult, too slow, too honest for a system that only rewards what it can immediately control? If that's the price of integrity, was it ever really a loss? Or was it the only way to survive with the music intact?